When I was first approached about presenting a TEDx talk, I responded in the way I do to most things. I said yes. I panicked. I ignored it for a little while. I panicked some more, and then I put off thinking about it until I could not put off thinking about it any longer. So now you're probably asking yourself, giving a TEDx talk, that's not like paying taxes, it's not like taking the SAT, it's not like giving blood while taking a physical. It's a privilege and it's really a choice. So if you didn't want to do it, why would you say yes? The answer is, and I think most of us have felt this at some point or another, many aspects of my professional journey, indeed many aspects of my life, have been shaped by what I thought I should do, not necessarily by what I thought I felt like doing at the time. And if that sounds like a negative, I'm here to tell you, I don't think it has to be. There's an assumption these days you can only live authentically if you follow your passion, pursue only those things that you love, learn to say no to everything else. But what if you don't yet know what those things are? Listening to the many voices, family, friends, coworkers, teachers, and the many cultural forces at play in the world today can lead us to hear so many shoulds and coulds and ought tos and must dos. It can be really overwhelming. But these words can also be powerful tools that push us to exceed our own expectations. They can lead us to take risks, experiment with ideas and identities, do things we would not otherwise do. The key is, and what's taken me many long and insecure years to learn, is this, that we have to filter those many voices and images and ideals and use them to discern our own minds. Trust that at the end of the day, your own voice is one worth hearing, one worth listening to, and use that to guide the way we engage with the world. The trick is to get the balance right, or at least as right as possible, to find that place between burden and motivation, obligation and opportunity. That's how I'm approaching my own life now. It's how I'm trying to approach my own leadership. But it hasn't always been the case. So as I step back and try to reframe that question, and the answer to why say yes to a TEDx talk when it's a lot of work and you're worried you're going to be judged and actually you probably don't have any profound life lessons to impart, it's simply this, that in sharing my story, you'll come to know how someone like me, with these insecurities and contradictions, like being a people lover who's congenitally awkward and uncertain, how someone like me came to lead an initiative from my university, Northeastern University, called Women Who Empower. And I hope that in sharing my stories, if any resonate even a little bit, that you'll give yourself permission to panic a little at the shoulds and coulds, procrastinate a little over the ought tos, without too much guilt. Because in knowing that you're not alone, that there's someone kind of like you out there, someone who doesn't even know you but gets you, I hope that in knowing that you'll find support and strength and confidence, those things that you'll need to tackle the big must-dos, those must-dos that are the foundation of how we strive to have impact in the world. I want to start by sharing a memory from elementary school. I have a vivid recollection of an experience that shaped some of my earliest relationships to the notion of should. I was a really shy kid. Like I said earlier, though my parents might completely dispute this, I've always felt a little bit awkward, a little outside, even though or perhaps because I was a good student. As a result, I was quiet in class. Responsive, but not assertive. Polite. Picture me at my little desk with the metal legs, second grade, hand half raised, because even though I knew the answer, I was hoping the teacher wouldn't look at me. I really preferred not to be called on. On the other hand, the most rambunctious, clever, outgoing boy in our class was never afraid to offer his opinion, whether or not his hand was raised. He was funny, charming, popular, and he was really, really, really smart. Looking back, he possessed what we call charisma. At the time, I was just more or less in awe of him. But the teacher didn't want me to be more like Johnny, quite the opposite. She moved Johnny's desk next to mine with the hope that he would become more like me, would adopt my quiet and unassuming ways. Well, needless to say, this was not successful. But leaving aside whether Mrs. whatever her name was, and I honestly don't remember what her name was, leaving aside whether she was inadvertently extinguishing a young man's light, by positioning me in this way, by setting me up as a role model in this particular way, I came away with a number of shoulds that had a lasting effect, some of which were useful and others that have taken me years to overcome. Like this: you should pay attention in class. Yes, probably a good idea. You should respect your teacher. Well, you should respect everyone. You should learn to listen. To this I say yes, yes, yes. You should never interrupt. Well, that one's a little trickier. I can't tell you how many times I came out of a meeting without contributing what I might have because I just couldn't bring myself to interrupt. You should not be disruptive. And clearly Mrs. whatever her name was did not anticipate Silicon Valley. My takeaway, probably not the right one, that the default of being quiet is preferable to the default of speaking up. So obviously this second grader didn't have enough sophisticated self-awareness to know which of these shoulds would serve me well and which would need to be discarded. A lot of them still live in my head. The point is, if we are open, if we're intentional, we can try to manage that delicate balance between shoulds that bring us down, that weigh us down, and shoulds that drive and propel us forward. And between those shoulds that are really just things that all civilized people should do. So now fast forward many years to early adulthood, the time in your life when shoulds should probably become coulds. Unlike so many of the students I work with today who are organized and ambitious and have life plans, I fell into my career. I often say that no one grows up aspiring to be a fundraiser or a senior vice president for advancement. I became a university administrator by accident. The truth is I had no idea what I wanted to be when I graduated from college. By the time I hit those undergraduate years, I'd shed a little bit of the childhood shyness, and I made up for it by having what was probably way too extroverted a time. Yikes. May 1986. The date hit. I didn't have a job. Better get one before Mom and Dad stopped paying the rent. I'd pursued a journalism major thinking I might be a magazine writer or a television reporter, but I hadn't done any of the right things, taken any of the right steps to land one of those jobs. So I took the first thing that came my way. No following of passion for me. I became a college admission counselor, visiting high schools, recruiting students, reviewing applications, giving tours. I loved it. Although I wasn't much older than the high school students I was working with, I just loved being able to interact with them, interact with their families, be part of what was a really important decision in their lives. I love the rhythm of the academic year. Every year, a new class of eager, excited freshmen coming in. But every time September rolled around, that undermining should in my head would tell me I should try to get a job outside of academia. I should do something more glamorous, more lucrative, maybe in PR and media. I didn't know. But something else was happening around the same time. I kept being asked by managers, by coworkers, if I could take something else on. Could I add enrollment management to my portfolio? Could I advise a new student group? Now, at the time, I was reading a lot about how to be successful. A lot was being published, magazine articles, books, and everything I read suggested that a successful career path was paved by learning to say no. Have focus. Eliminate the extraneous. Don't allow yourself to be a dumping ground for the things nobody else wants to do. But as you know from the very first sentence of this talk, no is not something that comes easily or naturally for me. And as my career advanced, I found that something interesting was happening. That I could turned into I can, and I can became I will, and I did. What happens, not surprisingly, is that can and will and did create competence. Competence leads to confidence, and those things together can lead to passion and to purpose. So all of those could use led me to heading up an entire student advising operation, and eventually the question, could you ever see yourself as a fundraiser? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. All of those led me to the stage of my journey where I find myself today, with the best job at the university because it connects people with unbelievable generosity and commitment with those whose lives are transformed because of the actions of others. Ought to's. Ought to is like should, but with a little more emphasis. Ought to sounds like something that Mrs. whatever her name was would have uttered on the regular. Ought tos can feel scolding. They sometimes made me feel less than, like I ought to have this high-flying career and live like Martha Stewart. Now, this was Martha Stewart pre-Snoop. Good things before she discovered better things. For working women of my generation, there was a notion that if we couldn't have it all, we ought to at least try to have it all. Let me tell you when this came to a crashing halt for me. One evening when I was leaving work, my daughter, Alex, age about 6, gave me a call. "Hi, Mom. Are you almost here?" I said, "Oh, no, I'm just leaving my office. I'm just headed to the parking structure." And she said, "But, Mom, you're supposed to pick me up from ballet tonight. Tonight is Katie's night at improv." Well, I hadn't remembered at all that I was supposed to be picking my daughter up. And she was sitting outside of her ballet studio. The doors had been locked. She was on the curb. And it was starting to get dark. I was at least 45 minutes away. And as I now stopped walking and started running to my car, I also started to cry. It was the lowest moment I could remember in my career. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I ought to give up. I ought to focus on being a great mom. I ought to stop trying to do too much. And then as I got in my car, battling not only the late afternoon traffic, but the tears in my eyes and couldn't see very well, there was actually an even more powerful feeling that came over me. And that was a must. I must keep going. I must not give up. Because if I can't do this with all of the support that I have, with all of the privileges, with my family, with my friends, how can I make the kinds of changes that are needed so others can do it? Not just professionals with young families, but anyone striving to do and be a lot in the world. That moment was a turning point. The time when a life and career filled with should and could and ought to turned into a must do. At Northeastern, that I must has become a we must. We must establish a platform where women and indeed all people seek to empower one another, as well as future generations, by sharing their stories and wisdom and expertise. A community we call Women Who Empower, a community that has turned from a series of events and summits into a true network with more than 160 mentoring relationships, 50 ambassadors from 19 countries, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarship support raised from close to 1,500 donors. How did it happen? Well, first, as there always is for me, there was a should. I was invited to a conference where the speakers ran the gamut from the chief marketing officer from the NFL to entrepreneurs to well-known authors. They had almost nothing in common, except that they were all successful, accomplished, and impressive. And they were all women. And they were all incredibly generous in offering their own experiences without any spin or varnish or hype. Now, if you've been paying any attention at all, you won't be surprised to know that when I was first invited, of course, I said yes. And then I wished I hadn't said yes because I didn't want to go. I wouldn't know anyone. I wouldn't be as snazzy as the other participants. I would be awkward. I would feel like an outsider. But I did go, and I was glad I went because I was utterly inspired. And then a could. We could do this in our community and for our community. Our team embraced the concept without hesitation and with more ought-to ideas than I could have ever imagined. Like, we ought to do this, not only in Boston, but all over the world. We ought to start our fund that supports our entrepreneurs. We ought to involve as many people as possible, let go of our ownership, let this initiative grow and evolve and thrive organically. I accept now that the voices of should, could, and ought to are always going to be in competition. There's that space in my head that houses the unhealthy vision of unobtainable perfection, and it's always going to be doing some battle with a place in my gut that I know needs those words to push myself out of my comfort zone. And I'm now okay living in that discomfort because it is that tension. It is those many competing, discordant, and contradictory voices that make up ultimately and ironically that singular concept I recognize as my voice. And that's led me to my passion, and it's led me to my purpose. More importantly, I have found that in sharing that voice, sharing that vulnerability and those stories with you and with others, I'm able to find community. How lucky am I to have found a community that wants to make the world just a little bit better for everyone around them? Because it is what we should do. It's what we can and ought to do. and it's what we must do. Thank you.